Hello, my name is Colin Stronach from the EFA Young People's Funding Team. I'm going to give you an update on EFA 16 to 19 funding for 2017-18. I'm going to cover four main areas in this presentation. Firstly, I'm going to describe how the funding formula will work for 17-18 and highlight the changes from last year. Secondly, I'll talk through the timeline for the allocations process and the data that we will use to calculate your allocation. Then I'll talk about the processes for business cases and infrastructure changes, including those situations where the lagged approach does not apply. And finally, I'll give a brief update on student support funding for 17-18. So, starting with an overview of the funding formula for 17-18. The key decisions affecting funding for next year were set out in a letter from Peter Mucklow, EFA Director for Young People, in December. The letter is available on our website and is a key source of information for all institutions with 16 to 19 funding. Firstly, I'd like to emphasise three areas where there is little or no change in 17-18 from previous years. The national rate of £4,000 for full-time 16 and 17-year-olds is unchanged, and the rates for 18-year-olds and part-time students will also remain the same as in previous years. There is also no change to the arrangements for formula protection funding or the condition of funding, other than those previously published, and I'll say more about those two areas in a moment. There are then three main areas where there is some change affecting allocations for 17-18, and I'll cover those in detail later in the presentation. I will also say something about how Block 2 disadvantaged funding will work in future with the new GCSE grades, although that will not affect allocations for another couple of years. As we announced last year, formula protection funding is being phased out over 6 years from the baseline year in 15-16, so the final year for any payments will be 2021. For many institutions, though, their formula protection funding will have been removed before then. We will apply a very similar approach to calculating FPF in 17-18 as we did in 16-17. We will reduce your FPF per student by the same amount as we did last year, so continuing the trajectory that we started at that stage. We will then multiply your FPF per student by your total number of students funded in 17-18, but we will cap that student number figure at 15-16 levels to reflect the number of students you had protection for in that baseline year. A more detailed description of the process and some example calculations are given on our formula protection funding page on gov.uk. We will continue to review this calculation each year. Now, moving on to the condition of funding. It is important to be aware that the condition of funding policy was tightened in 2015-16. As well as requiring all students without a grade C in GCSE Maths or English to continue to study those subjects as part of their post-16 study programmes, we introduced additional requirements for those students who have achieved a grade D at GCSE. Full-time students who have prior attainment of grade D and started their study programmes on or after 1st of August 2015 must be enrolled on GCSEs rather than on stepping stone qualifications. This additional requirement is being applied to the 15-16 data used to calculate 17-18 allocations. Once the number of students not meeting the condition of funding has been identified, the process will then apply in 17-18 allocations in a similar way to 16-17. An overall tolerance of 5% will be applied to any funding reductions, and any reductions above that tolerance will be applied at half the national rate. More detail on the condition of funding is given on gov.uk. So, moving on to the timeline for the allocations process. This first slide sets out the key dates up to the end of February, as set out in the funding letter in December. In January and early February, we're sending out information on funding factors to give you early information on the values we expect to use to calculate your allocation. Along with this, where possible, we provide supporting information that shows you how we've used your data to calculate those funding factors. We then aim to send out allocations to the majority of institutions by the end of February. Exceptions to this timing are those FE institutions where the allocations are based on RO6 data submitted in February, some higher education institutions, and a small number of other more complex cases. In those cases, allocations are likely to be sent out in March. Once you've received your allocation, we expect that for most institutions that will be final, However, if there are significant issues with the data you return to us that affect your allocation, you'll have an opportunity to send in a business case. We'll confirm the deadline for business cases when we send you your allocation, but currently we expect that deadline to be the 7th of April for most institutions. We'll then review business cases during April and May, and we expect to confirm the outcomes by early June. I'll say more about the process for handling business cases shortly. Moving on now to the data we'll use to calculate your allocations, starting with mainstream schools and academies. I'll say more about special schools and academies later. The main data that we use for your allocations is based on the autumn 2016 census. This gives us data for two different groups of students. Firstly, we will use the data you return in the census for students enrolled this year, 16-17, as the basis for your lagged student numbers for next year. And secondly, we will use the data for those students enrolled last year, 15-16, to determine the main funding factors, size of programme, cost weighting and so on, that we use to calculate your funding allocation. This information is also used to calculate any impact on the condition of funding. This year, for the first time, we will also be using information from the autumn census to calculate funding for disadvantaged Block 2. I'll say more about that later on. As last year, we will also then use matched data to calculate funding from the large programme uplift. Finally, we'll use data collected from local authorities to determine high needs Element 2 place funding for mainstream academies. Element 2 provides the first £6,000 of support costs for high needs students. For mainstream maintained schools, the process has changed slightly this year, and Element 2 place funding will be allocated at local authority level. Local authorities will then agree allocations of Element 2 directly with their schools. For FE institutions then, the data sources are set out on this next slide. In most cases, your lagged student numbers will be based on the ILR R04 return from December. We will then use data on in-year recruitment patterns from last year to give the expected number of students for the whole year. We'll review the R04 figures against the R06 return received in February. Where there's a significant increase or decrease in student numbers, we'll then revise the allocation accordingly. For those commercial and charitable providers where there's significant in-year recruitment, we will use data for the rolling 12-month period, February 2016 to January 2017. And for some institutions, we will use whole year data for 15-16 instead. The detail of these approaches will be set out in your allocation statement. As for schools, we will then use data from 15-16 to determine the funding factors that we use to calculate your allocation, including for the first time Block 2 disadvantage funding. We will then use matched data on student achievement to calculate the additional funding for large programmes. Finally, as in previous years, we will use data collected from local authorities to determine high needs Element 2 place funding. Special post-16 institutions will continue to be funded on the basis of Element 1 programme funding calculated using the national formula, and Element 2, which will provide the first £6,000 of support costs for high needs students. Both Element 1 and Element 2 numbers will be derived from ILR data, and we expect to confirm by the end of January which dataset will be used, along with the approach to calculating funding factors. For non-maintained special schools, the value of funding for students of all ages, both pre- and post-16, will remain at £10,000 per place. Student numbers will be derived from school census data, and again we expect to confirm by the end of January which dataset will be used. For maintained special schools and special academies, we will again use data collected from local authorities to determine place funding allocations. As for non-maintained special schools, the value of funding for students of all ages will remain at £10,000 per place. As I mentioned earlier, we are changing the data source used to calculate Block 2 disadvantage funding this year. That is, the funding allocated based on the number of students who have not achieved a grade C or above in maths or English by the age of 16. This year, for the first time, we'll be using data returned directly by institutions in the ILR or school census to calculate this funding. This means that the data used for this will be consistent with that for most other funding factors, and the data lag will reduce from 3 years to 2. While this is an improvement in the process and increases transparency, we recognise that for some institutions with decreasing number of students eligible for this funding, the change will bring forward the reduction in disadvantaged funding they will receive. We will therefore be mitigating the impact of the change in the first year by calculating the equivalent factor from the matched data as we did previously. If there's a decrease as a result of the change in data sources, we will take the average of the two factors. We've reviewed the data for all institutions, and in most cases this appears to be robust, but in a small number of cases we have identified possible data quality issues. If an institution does have issues with data quality, then they'll need to raise this with us as a business case, as described later on. There's also a second point to note on disadvantaged Block 2 funding, though this will not affect allocations in 17-18. As most of you will know, the grading system for GCSEs is changing, and this will affect students taking Maths and English GCSEs this year. The new grades are numeric from 9 to 1 and replace the existing A* to G system. As a result, we need to update the threshold for Maths and English grades that will apply to the calculations of disadvantaged Block 2 funding in future. The threshold we'll apply for this purpose is a grade 4. That is, students with grades below 4 will be eligible for Block 2 funding in a similar way to students with grades below C based on the current grades. The first cohort of students this will affect will be enrolled in post-16 education and training from 17-18, so the new grading will first affect Block 2 allocations from 19-20 onwards. This is a similar approach to the one we've already communicated on the condition of funding in Maths and English, and at this stage we've confirmed in the funding letter that the grade 4 threshold will apply for the first 2 years of the new grades. Moving on now to an issue which primarily affects colleges and private training providers. Students aged 19 or over on 31st of August who do not have high needs are normally funded by the Skills Funding Agency. However, those students aged 19 or over who are continuing a programme they began aged 16 to 18 that was funded by the EFA will then continue to be funded using the EFA funding formula and rates to the end of that programme. This ensures that we maintain a consistent funding approach for the whole programme. Although the EFA formula is used for those students, the responsibility for paying for them is currently split between the two agencies. At present, EFA funds those 19 plus continuing students in schools, academies and sixth form colleges, while SFA funds them in FE colleges and private providers. From 17-18 we are going to streamline the position so that all 19 plus continuing students are funded by EFA, no matter what institution they are enrolled in, as long as that institution is already funded by EFA for 16 to 18 provision. This will affect those colleges and private training providers with existing 19 plus continuing students funded by SFA. For those institutions, in this first year, we will calculate the amount of funding for this activity and then subtract that amount from your SFA allocation and add it to the EFA allocation, so there will be no impact on your overall funding. Also for 17-18, we will update the guidance for the ILR to enable you to record your 19 plus continuing students as EFA funded. From 18-19 onwards, this provision will then be included in your EFA allocation automatically on a lagged basis. Moving on now to some other key elements of the allocations process. Firstly, business cases. As in past years, the default position is we use the data you return to us to calculate your allocation, but by exception we will consider business cases where there's been a major error in the data. In the December funding letter, we've confirmed the thresholds that will apply to most business cases, and they're set out on this slide. We've not specified a threshold in advance for Block 2 disadvantaged cases at this stage, as we're using a new data source for that factor, as mentioned earlier. To ensure we have a consistent approach, we will therefore set the threshold for those cases once we've reviewed any cases we receive. Note that in 16-17 allocations, as an exception, we did not apply standard thresholds to any business cases related to planned hours data from the autumn 2014 school census. This reflected the unusual nature of that particular return, where it was used to collect planned hours data for 2 separate years, and so could otherwise have a material impact on 2 years' allocations. For 1718 onwards, it's important to be clear that the standard thresholds apply to all planned hours cases, whether for schools, academies or FE institutions. Note also that in 1718 we'll now be applying a threshold to cases for data error affecting the condition of funding, as referred to on this slide. It's important to note that these thresholds purely determine whether we will consider a case or not. We will then decide whether to agree the case based on the evidence provided. As mentioned earlier, the deadline for business cases is likely to be 7th of April, though this may vary for some institutions depending on when their allocations are sent out. We'll confirm the deadline when we send you your allocation statement, and it's very important that any cases are submitted by the published deadline. In previous years we've had too many cases submitted after the deadlines, and if we receive late cases this year there is no guarantee that we'll be able to consider them. We'll confirm more detail of the process for sending in business cases in the guidance that we send with your allocation. In most cases, other than those academies that are funded on the basis of their estimated numbers, we calculate the allocations for institutions on the basis of lagged student numbers. However, there are some situations where the lagged approach does not apply, particularly where there are infrastructure changes, as set out on this slide. The lagged approach does not apply to new provision, and I'll say more about new provision in a moment. It also doesn't apply to closing provision, either where provision closes totally in a particular year, or where it is winding down over a period of time. We may also remove institutions from the lagged approach where a significant transfer of provision takes place. This might be linked to a merger or reorganisation, or it might be linked to the transfer of a subcontracting arrangement. Where there is a transfer of numbers between institutions, we would usually expect there to be growth in one institution and a reduction elsewhere. It's only in exceptional circumstances we'd expect there to be net growth overall in the allocations. Where institutions funded on a lagged basis have exceptional growth in year, we then review those cases annually. The thresholds for this can vary from year to year, subject to affordability, but it's important to be aware these are generally very high to reflect the exceptional nature of this growth. Typically, we might expect only around 1% of institutions to be in scope for in-year growth. This in-year growth process does not apply to private training providers funded under a contract, who have separate arrangements for reconciliation of over and under delivery, or to academies funded on estimates, who are subject to pupil number adjustments. Now, a little more on new sixth forms. Guidance on the process to add a sixth form to an existing school or academy is available on gov.uk as part of the process for making significant change to an institution. There are separate documents for academies and for maintained schools. The guidance explains the criteria that will be used by regional schools commissioners and local authorities in making decisions on new sixth forms. Once a new sixth form has been approved, the numbers funded will follow a standard approach as the institution builds up its numbers. In year one, we'll normally fund a new sixth form based on 1/3 of its overall planned capacity. In year two, we'll then fund that sixth form for twice the number actually recruited in year one. And then in year three, we'll fund them based on the lagged approach. Our experience is that this standard approach matches the profile of recruitment for most new sixth forms. However, some institutions plan to build up more quickly and others more slowly, so we will consider well-evidenced business cases for a different profile on an exceptional basis. Now, an update on subcontracting. We updated the guidance on subcontracting for 16-17 in summer last year. The new guidance stated that to comply with the school registration regulations, all pupils enrolled at a school or academy must attend that institution at least some of the time. This means that schools and academies can no longer subcontract the whole of a student's programme to another organisation. That means that we would not then expect to fund any subcontracted student starting a programme who is not attending the school or academy at least once a week. We set out in the subcontracting guidance the approach for winding down existing arrangements that are not compliant with that new guidance. The guidance stated that existing arrangements could continue in 16-17, but any whole programme subcontracting by schools and academies for 17-18 should be agreed in advance by the EFA by September 2016, and any such arrangements must be completed by the end of 17-18 at the latest. It's also important to note that subcontracting can't be used to avoid existing age restrictions. For example, a college could not subcontract 19 to 24 high needs provision to an 11 to 18 school, and a school with a sixth form could not subcontract provision to an 11 to 16 school. As I mentioned earlier, where an institution withdraws from a significant size of subcontracting arrangement that is then picked up by another institution, we review the impact on their lagged numbers and would normally expect to transfer student numbers between the two institutions. Where subcontracting does take place, we expect institutions and your governing bodies to assure yourselves that you're compliant with all of the subcontracting controls guidance and our other funding guidance. We're monitoring the levels of subcontracting through data returns, and auditors will be checking to ensure that provision is compliant. Now, moving on to student support funding. This year, we'll calculate free meals allocations for FE institutions based on the end-year ILR data for 15-16, as well as the in-year data for 16-17. As last year, we'll again make an adjustment to allocations to take account of the overlap between free meals and discretionary bursary funding. And also, as last year, there'll be no ring fence between the free meals and bursary allocations to maximise flexibility for institutions receiving both allocations. The requirement to promote and provide free meals for all eligible students who request them remains. No change is planned to the £2.41 rate for free meals. There are no significant changes to other student support schemes for the coming year. Vulnerable bursaries and Care to Learn continue to be managed through the Student Bursary Support Service, operated by Capita on our behalf. The rules for eligibility for funding for those schemes remain unchanged. Finally then, how to find out more if you have further queries. Firstly, there's a large amount of information online on our website. This slide shows some of the main links that you may find useful. If you can't find what you want through one of those links, then the search function on gov.uk may well help you to find the right information. Our e-bulletins are also an important source of information, and we use those to highlight key publications, as well as letting you know when we issue specific documents related to allocations. The e-bulletin is issued weekly at most times of year, and we'd encourage you to subscribe to ensure you receive the most up-to-date information. Finally, if you have any queries that can't be resolved through these routes, then please do contact us directly. This slide has a link to the online form you can use to send a query through to our inquiry service. Thank you for listening, and I hope you found this presentation helpful.